our final, we're gathering right now for our final speaker, and I'm excited to actually present and moderate her conversation today, only because I'm also a solution-focused therapist and I love the whole concept. So I'm particularly interested in her work. A little bit about Carol. Carol Buchholz-Holland is a PhD, and her present commitment to work is in the Associate Professorship and School Counseling Coordinator of the Counselor Education Graduate Program at North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota. She is a national certified counselor and is a former licensed professional counselor and school counselor. In addition, Carol is a former president of the North Dakota School Counselor Association and the North Dakota Association for Counselor Education and Supervision. She has presented internationally and throughout the United States on topics that pertain to the solution-focused approach. And some of her research interests include solution-focused applications in school settings and creative solution-focused counseling activities. She's a very devoted and very dedicated commitment person to the Oxford Symposium, and it's good to see and hear her today again, and looking forward to your work, to everyone to hear. Carol?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. All right, are you all able to see the PowerPoint? Okay.
You are.
Okay, fantastic. So it is such an honor to be with all of you here today, and I have to say a little bit humbled, especially after hearing the awesome presentations, and what a tough group to follow up. What an impressive group of students with that. So I'm excited to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and that's using the solution-focused approach with immigrant and refugee students. And using kind of the solution-focused term, I have to say my best hopes for these 30 minutes is to talk about some of the possible challenges that immigrant and refugee students might experience, and then to provide a very brief overview of the solution-focused approach, and then to talk about the reasons why this approach is a good fit for use with immigrant and refugee students, and then to give a brief case example of how you might apply it with that. So in terms of challenges, there's really a wide range of challenges that we know that immigrant and refugee students might face, and it can feel very overwhelming at times, and students might feel a bit hopeless or helpless. And that's where I feel that an approach like solution-focused approach is really important, and why it's a good fit for it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in terms of some of the challenges they might experience, this is kind of a long list, but it's not all inclusive with this. But some of the experiences that they might encounter are maybe prejudice, discrimination, maybe microaggressions. There could be untreated mental health or physical illnesses. It could be family financial challenges, family separation, kind of a wide range of this. But then in addition to that, we know also about past traumatic experiences or even current experiences, which can also be higher with those students who are not transnational with that. In addition to this long list of potential challenges that the students might face, as mental health practitioners, we also have to be aware of that some of the students that we work with who are immigrants or refugees might find that receiving mental health services stigmatizing, or they could potentially have a negative view of mental health services, or maybe have a mistrust or underuse them. Or maybe it's something that this wasn't even available in their home country. In addition, some of the students might feel that topics, whether it's depression or anxiety or PTSD, some of those might be taboo to discuss, especially with a non-family member, someone who's not part of their cultural community. In addition, some of the students, they might also present more somatic symptoms instead of revealing mental health concerns. And so that's something too that as mental health professionals that we have to be aware of or think about that. And then also that understanding that some of the students who've experienced trauma may have been diagnosed because their trauma might have been, people might have picked it up or diagnosed them as having possibly like ADHD or ODD, for example. So taking that all into consideration, I think it's important to try to find an approach that is a good fit that can work with a wide range of groups. And I think also that is to find one that's trauma sensitive. And I feel that, when my students, when I'm working with practicum students or intern students, a lot of them are saying like, what would be a good approach? And of course, I'm passionate about this, but I feel that, and hopefully after today, you'll also get a good sense of why I believe it is a good fit. So just a brief overview of the solution-focused approach, and this is going to be very brief to keep this within the 30 minutes. Insoo Kimberg and Steve DeShazer are credited as being as helping develop the solution-focused approach in the early 80s with the help of their colleagues. And they founded the Brief Family Therapy Center at Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And what I find interesting too about how they developed this is that they observed hundreds of hours of therapy, and they were noting what questions and the client answers that led to that, I think what they say is more real life change. And what they observed, they were noticing patterns of these exceptions when the problem was maybe less frequent, less intense, or even absent. And those exceptions, and I think looking for those exception questions are really important, is that it's exploring those exceptions, those times that when you do that, when you're looking at when the problem might have been absent or less intense or less frequent, is that there could be potential solutions within that already exist. And so that's where the focus, we're looking at what's already working for the client, which is one of the central tenets of solution-focused brief therapy. And another part of this development too was that they started to really focus on the client's hopes for the future, about what they wanted instead of the problem, instead of focusing on the past. And this is where I think many traditional counseling approaches are spending a lot of time on the past, and we're looking at flipping that, where the majority of the conversation is talking about looking at the future for that. And notice how I highlighted the instead, because what we're looking for is really asking them about what do they want instead. And that paradigm shift, I think, is also really important about the difference between problem solving versus solution building. And I like how Insoo Kimberg said, it sounds like it's a play on word, but it is a profoundly different paradigm. And when I think about working with students who are immigrants or refugees, that some of their problems are out of their control. They don't have a control over it. They can be very significant issues, and yet sometimes small solutions, which can be completely unrelated to the problem itself, can also make a profound difference too in the lives of the students. And as I mentioned here too, this is something that when I'm teaching my students or my graduate students about using this approach, is to really be thinking about what do people want instead. And I think sometimes when people ask questions, we tend to ask, if we ask a client what would they like, they might initially say, well, I don't want to feel depressed anymore. I don't want this. And those are more negative goals or avoid goals. What we're hoping though is by encouraging them, asking good questions, to flip it and to ask them what would they like instead, and to talk in the positive terms. So for example, instead of just saying what you don't want, I don't want to feel depressed anymore, we ask them, what would you like to be have instead? Well, I'd like to feel happy, or I'd like to. And so what we take that then is, happy is a pretty abstract concept. I think follow-up questions that are really helpful is, what would you be doing? What would you be doing when using presuppositional phrasing, the when instead of if you're feeling better, but when you're feeling better, tell me more about what you'll be doing. And what would you like to be doing, and so forth. And that sometimes can be a little bit tricky. I know even with my graduate students, when I talk with them about that, is they'll sometimes talk in terms of, they'll throw out a negative goal, and I have to encourage them subtly to say, okay, so what do you want instead? In addition to this, the solution-focused approach offers us a wide variety of questions and skills that unfortunately I don't have a chance to go through all of these, but just to list some of the highlights. There's more of them too, but some of my favorite questions that I encourage people to add to their toolbox with it. And, I often say that even if you don't become a solution-focused counselor, that there's still, I think, some amazing questions that you can use that I feel can enhance the work that you're doing, whether it is asking the miracle question or coping questions or the wonderful scaling questions. Any of those I think can be extremely helpful for that. And so, to get a little bit more detail about that, I recommend also, following up, looking at more of these questions or examples, or I'd be more than happy to share my information with you too. But it's also important to highlight that the solution-focused approach was developed using a linguistics theory. Because of that, we recognize the importance of how we phrase things and the wording of it. And so that's why, we a lot of times, like when you look at training materials and so forth, is that they provide wonderful examples of questions. And I tell students oftentimes, if you have 5 great questions to ask, that sometimes can have a major impact on the direction and kind of the feel of the conversation for that. So, maybe have it when you're first learning it, have a few of those as prompts to use that. So just want to highlight this. Okay, and this is another wonderful book by Frederica Bannock from the Netherlands that I love, and that our practicum students also use this about 1001 solution-focused questions. I just have to say that it's a wonderful book that a person could purchase even on Amazon that would give you a wide range of questions. And we also too, with these questions that I encourage, and we've developed different creative solution-focused activities that we include this even when we're using games with kids, like even simple games like Sorry or Chutes and Ladders or so forth. There's a way of including those questions in even into everyday games that children may play. So I want to kind of jump into then talking about 10 reasons why the solution-focused approach works well with immigrant and refugee students. So first of all, solution-focused brief therapy is inherently a culturally sensitive approach. And part of the reason for that is that it really emphasizes respect, empathy, and I think the term that we often use is that respectful curiosity, that when we are asking questions, it truly is for the benefit of the client, and we ask it in a respectful manner. I often, will say, like, I think it's helpful, especially when you're working with someone who's experienced trauma, of asking them, would it be okay if I ask you more about this? Not that I need to have a great detail about it, but I also want to put or empower the client so that they know that they get to decide whether or not they want to share. But what also is exciting too is the belief that clients are the experts of their own lives, and this includes children. It's not saying that we don't have expertise also as clinicians with this, but the clients, they understand their lives, they've lived it, and so we want to honor that and respect that. And we take that non-expert stance of leading from one step behind and taking a not knowing stance, so we don't make assumptions. And I think that can be extremely powerful too when you're working with children and adolescents, that you don't make assumptions. For example, if a student is missing a lot of school, they have chronic absences, instead of lecturing them about why are they not attending school, you will ask them more about, I noticed that you have missed a lot of days. I'm sure you have a good reason for it. Would you be willing to tell me more about that? That we're inviting them and not making assumptions. I think if we do that, students will be less confrontational about it or with that. So I think they'd be more open. In addition to that, we don't determine what the best solutions are for clients. Instead, we're asking those carefully constructed questions to find out and help our clients identify some of the solutions, maybe based on some of their own past successes, or to bring into light some of the exceptions that maybe they hadn't even thought of before. Number two, that we also know that the solution-focused approach is evidence-based and it's developmentally appropriate to use with children and adolescents from a wide variety of cultures. And so just to briefly summarize, there's numerous studies right now that provide evidence for it, not only in clinical settings, but in school settings, And it can be adapted also for even the younger children by using creative activities. And there's some wonderful books out there too by colleagues like Pamela King or Insoo Kimberg and Drew Steiner have some, just to name a couple of books that are out there. As I had mentioned earlier, that solution-focused approach believes that clients are experts of their own lives, and they're the ones that determine the goals of the counseling sessions. And so this might be a little bit different in terms of, or like you might get a referral when you're in a school for a specific reason. But what we believe is that even if someone refers you for an issue, we're going to ask the student and we're going to invite them to discuss what they want to talk about. And by inviting them to help set the goals of the counseling session, how they would like to spend our time together, we might actually end up getting much further and getting to underneath the cause. Instead of just talking about the behaviors that people might see, we might be able to encourage the student to share maybe what's underneath it. And a while back, and I wish I could remember the person that had phrased this, they talked about solution-focused practitioners are being like taxi drivers, or I guess now I have to update that to Uber drivers. But they said that it's our job to ask the client where they want to go using the client's goals and help them get there. So we are the facilitators of that conversation, and hopefully we can co-collaborate and work with them so that they can get where they're hoping to go. Okay. Number four, fourth reason is that it's designed to be short-term solution building approach, and it emphasizes the importance of goal setting process. And why I feel that this is also really helpful for it is that goal setting or solution building, it is sometimes is less intimidating to do that. So instead of concentrating on the client's problems, what we're doing is we're looking at what do they want to do instead. And so for some individuals, it may not even feel like therapy because they don't have to necessarily reveal that much information in there. And instead, we're looking at kind of some fast and easy solutions to kind of get to where they want to go for that. And then number five is that it engages students in the counseling process. And one of the things too that we know is that students are more invested in goals or solutions that they help generate on their own or they co-construct. And you get more buy-in when it's the students who are involved versus me as the adult saying, okay, this is what we're going to be working on with it. And there's a greater chance that the students can actually generate identified solutions, especially if they're going to be more willing to do it if they've been successful doing it before in the past. We know that people probably have a greater tendency of doing something if they know they've been successful versus asking someone to do something they've never done before. For example, if you were to ask me right now to run a 10K, I would probably look at you going, there's no way, because I've never been successful running that far. But if you said, if you could walk a 5K, that would be doable. And I'd be much more likely to get engaged with that. Also too, students are more likely to become engaged in the counseling process when it focuses on more positive traits instead of their deficiencies. The conversation feels much different when you're talking about things that they can do versus things they can't. And that's where, and that's a different talk, but why I feel it's important too and very helpful when schools can embrace this strength-based solution-focused approach, even when we're having meetings like IEP meetings or 504 meetings about making sure that we talk about things that students are also successful with and not just talking about their deficiencies for that. Okay, number six, also the solution-focused approach helps identify their own resources, strengths, and coping strategies that fit within their own culture. And I think that's also very important to be culturally sensitive for this, is because we are asking them about things that have happened before in the past or things that they feel. We're engaging them in this process with it and identifying. I underlined the resources here too, because I also want to highlight that with the solution-focused approach, when in some cultures, I think talking about or asking people to directly talk about their strengths might feel a little bit uncomfortable or not congruent with their cultures. I know one of my students that I'd worked with in the past, she had said that it makes her uncomfortable, and it's not something that in her culture they necessarily do, to single out and just talk about their strengths. And she said it would feel more comfortable if you asked me to help identify resources. What resources do I have? And so I just wanted to mention that to you. And I think too that by asking about resources or competence seeking, or what they can contribute to their own communities, if we ask them to give back to the communities, it's a way of empowering our students with this. And so I think that is really helpful for that. In addition to about asking questions that can uncover maybe times that they were successful in the past, like I said, those past successes, or identify coping strategies, that's very helpful. And someone might ask, well, if they've already done it before in the past, why aren't they doing it? Well, the reality is, and we can even say it for ourselves, that sometimes we forget and we about things that have worked for us in the past. And it just takes a good prompt or a good question to go, that's right, I hadn't thought of that. So we're trying to bring this to the level of awareness for them. And then the next one I think is also really powerful for this is that solution-focused brief counseling helps increase a sense of agency and expanding pathways for this. And I like to bring in Snyder's hope theory. And a while back, I had written a book chapter about using the solution-focused approach with students who are experiencing suicidal ideation. And I thought that Snyder's hope theory really connected well with the solution-focused brief counseling, because Snyder talks about, if you want to think about it, a stool with 3 legs, he talks about there needs to be 3 components in order to build hope. One of them is the presence of a goal or goals, because he believes that goals are an object of hope. There's something that you are hopeful or you're trying to move forward. And of course, solution-focused goal setting, that's an important part of the solution-focused approach. So we know that we've got that. So the presence of goals, and then pathway thoughts, which is very important for that, especially like, for example, if you're working with someone who is in crisis or experiencing what we call constricted thinking, where maybe they think there's only one way to ease their pain or to get rid of their pain, and that could be potentially suicide. What we're trying to is expand pathways, about thinking of ways, are there more pathways where that you can identify that can help you reach your goal? Your goal is that you want to feel better, you want to be able to get more engaged in your life, or so forth. And so that's also something that's solution-focused brief therapy helps students identify coping strategies that have worked before in the past, identify new ones. And so that's the pathway thought. And then the final one is the agency thought, about the feeling that they have this increased sense of agency, that they can actually accomplish that. And that's also, we can build agency thought by helping students identify when they have been successful for that they feel that they're capable of doing this. And so all 3 of those, and I bring this when I teach a crisis and trauma class too, is about thinking about goals, pathways, that agency thought, I think are so important. And they work well with solution-focused brief therapy, but also with other counseling approaches. But I just want to really highlight that. That I feel that it's really important. And since immigrant and refugee students often may face some pretty complex or big challenges, they might feel overwhelmed or hopeless at times, they could really benefit from approaches such as the solution-focused approach that can help build hope. Also, some solution-focused practitioners introduce the concept of courage or pride into the conversation with us, about identifying things that took a lot of courage, or that they have that sense of pride about what they accomplished for that. And that courage about realizing, even though they were very fearful, they were still able to overcome that, I think is really powerful for that. And hopefully we can help our clients move from perceiving themselves as a victim and shift to the survivor. But I think ultimately we'd love to see them become a thriver, despite some of the challenges that they have dealt with. And then also solution-focused therapy believes that small changes can lead to bigger changes. And so breaking things down so that it doesn't seem so absolutely overwhelming. So we as practitioners are really trying to recognize and we highlight, we reinforce those micro successes. And hopefully by doing that, identifying those small steps, they can move forward towards their desired goal. And that might energize them, generate hope, and hopefully it can lead to bigger changes. And people, for example, that are experiencing depression, sometimes just getting out of bed in the morning, that's a huge accomplishment. And we don't want to minimize that. We want to recognize that. And then what we're going to do is break it down into small steps. Well, how did you do that? What did you do next? What else? What else? And really ask that. So that slow and steady progress, it makes a big difference as opposed to taking those big leaps. So that those small changes, they can accumulate over time and they can, that positive forward momentum can make a big difference. And I like this picture too, because it also emphasizes the importance of taking small steps. Because if you're working with someone and they're setting really big goals right away, just like the person on the left-hand side, is that they might be overwhelmed right away and it's difficult to even start, versus a small steps can hopefully eventually lead them to the goal that they want to achieve, if you can make it more manageable and so that they're not overwhelmed. And another interesting part too, that with the solution-focused brief therapy, is the relationship question, because it can bring family and friends together into the counseling session. And we know that in many cultures is that family, friends, their community are an important part of the counseling process, and yet they may not be available or may be involved in the counseling process, and yet they can still be, at least in spirit, part of it with it. And so, for example, we could just ask simple relationship questions such as, what would be the first thing your father noticed you doing when you're feeling more relaxed? What would your best friend say is your greatest strength? Asking kind of that third person perspective. I think sometimes too, those questions like, what would your best friend say about you, versus me asking a student, what would you say is your best strength? It's a little bit less intimidating, and I think people are more likely to answer or think of it because there's less pressure on it with that. So the relationship question, I think, is a really powerful piece. I think also what is very interesting is that the solution-focused approach can help reduce the chance of re-traumatizing students who've experienced past traumas. And I often get asked by students when they initially start learning about the solution-focused approach, they think sometimes, well, it's great, it's a very positive approach, it's short-term, but they also think that the issues that you can use it with may be pretty basic, nothing too serious with it. And I said, well, actually, when you look at the literature, you see that it can work very well with people who have experienced serious trauma or have long-term mental health illnesses, like, for example, schizophrenia or so forth. And so part of it too, the reason why I say that reduces the chance of re-traumatizing it, is that solution-focused brief therapy does not require the client to provide a detailed history of their traumatic experiences. Insoo Kim Berg, I think, really interesting. I'll show you in just a little bit about an interview that she'd done, where she says you don't even need to know the problem or the trauma in order to facilitate healing, because she's more interested in what the client goals are or what their preferred future is. And so working collaboratively with that. And so instead of spending a lot of time talking about what happened to the client or the past trauma, which sometimes some traditional approaches spend a lot of time doing that, actually the majority of the time is spent on what the client wants, the preferred future, and also what the client did. And this is where that courage or that pride can go in, about what did they do to help overcome the challenge or the trauma that they've experienced it. And I think that's a really powerful piece for it. And it's not that we don't want students or we don't want them to share any of that, but I think that we just are not focusing so much on it. I feel though that you can individualize it very easily by asking a student, What would be most helpful for me to know about what you experienced? What would you like me to know? And that invites them, and that some students will need to share it with you. It's very cathartic for them to talk more about the traumatic experience, and others are going like a sense of relief of, oh good, they're not going to make me talk about this right now with it. And so I think that is, to me is very exciting to look at, and knowing that this can work well. And so it will maybe be less threatening to people, knowing that they don't have to relive some of this. I've looked at some of the literature too, that's when they're comparing some of the trauma-focused approaches versus solution-focused approach, that they said that sometimes client retention can also be higher sometimes with a solution-focused approach, because of the fact that they're not expected to share, and it's less intrusive form of counseling for that. So this is the video here, and I would be more than happy to share my PowerPoint with you with this information. I'll send this to Brian too, with one of the videos I love about Insu talking, being interviewed about working with a young woman who had experienced a significant traumatic event, who was feeling shame, who also, is very difficult for her to talk about what she experienced. And Insu said, that's okay, I don't need to know the details, but what would you like instead? And that's the conversation worked on with that. I have to do a little shout out to Ed Jacobs, who developed impact therapy, and he uses props in counseling. And one of the things that I love, and I think I still remember when I went to a training many years ago, part of his props, he actually has a rear view mirror, and he talks about, uses the analogy of driving a car. And he asks, like, how would you like to drive your life? Do you want to drive using the rear view mirror, the past, or would you rather be using the majority of the time the front windshield, the present or future? And I think it makes sense where we're going, like, in order to move forward, it's important that you look towards the present and the future for that. But it's not saying, though, at times we don't need to look at the past. But I think I always remember this, put an analogy with it. This is also a quote that I found many years ago too, that it talks about, there's nothing wrong about looking at the past. I just need to learn not to stare. And this really stuck with me too, of people saying like, well, you totally solution-focused practitioners disregard the past. And we don't necessarily, we just look at things a little bit differently, but there's nothing wrong with it, but we just need to learn not to stare. And I think many traditional approaches almost they spend a lot of time looking at the past, which is something that you can't change, versus let's look at the present and towards the future, something that we can have an impact on. And Hae-Sun Moon also, I like this chart too, where she talks about a shift in the conversation with us, is that when we do look at the past, instead of looking at the troubled past, this quadrant 3, we're looking at the resourceful past, about what they've done, the resources that they have, past successes, so forth, and then also that preferred future. And wrapping it all, tying it all into about looking at the meta model here in terms of the solution-focused approach. Even though I'm talking about using this as an intervention in the schools, easily this solution-focused approach can be used as a family intervention. But two, it can be based on more proactive activities and prevention in the school and with families, about getting into the classrooms, in the having a strength-based common language that can be used throughout the schools and with parents and so forth. That's a whole nother talk, but I just want to mention to you, I'm always excited to know that it can fit all 4 quadrants of that. And it's a good fit with the school-based family counseling for all these reasons for this, about being strength-based and collaborative, culturally sensitive, action-oriented, and so forth. All these, just to kind of highlight that. And then briefly, and I know I'm kind of running out of time, but I also just want to very, very briefly mention like a case study here about a student, Amal, who was 16, who's originally from Iraq. And she and her family arrived in the United States when she was 10 and resettled in a small North Dakota community. Until recently, she had maintained an A average in school. And however, though, she's been experiencing several somatic symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, dizziness over the past couple of months. In addition, she's had problems focusing in class, her homework, and so fortunately a week ago, she met with her family physician and had a complete physical. They found no underlying health conditions, and her family physician suggested that she meet with her school counselor or another school-based mental health professional with this. And so I just wanted to highlight here about what a typical first session would be with this, to kind of walk through this quickly with it. And the first one too is about the importance of developing rapport with the student using problem-free talk at the beginning, building that rapport and focusing on working with the student, not the problem with it. And then asking the best hopes question. And this is one too that when I'm training new practicum students and interns, I say, I think it's really important to ask, the goals or the best hopes. What would be your best hopes? What would you like to see us doing together within, if we have a half an hour that would tell you that our time together was really helpful, that it was meaning. So it focus things on, and, for those of you who have worked with children and adolescents, sometimes to the best hopes, you have to narrow it down. What would be the most helpful for us to discuss today? Because they might be presenting with 5 or 10 different issues, but to narrow it down with it, and then beginning that goal setting process with it. And then the next step, if the goal setting, if they need a little bit more help with that too, asking a miracle question. The miracle question, I'll just kind of summarize a little bit about that miracle of being, if when you go to sleep tonight, and the reason that you came to counseling today, that a miracle had taken place, and but you didn't know that miracle had happened, and the next day you wake up, what would be the first sign that would tell you that miracle happened? What would you be doing? What would other people notice you doing? Notice I'm having more concrete things, and that doing part can be working towards that goal setting, because maybe it might be that they're finally hanging out with their friends again, or they're visiting, or they're doing homework. We're kind of setting up goals using that miracle question. And to be culturally sensitive, you might change even using the word miracle question and talking about if they have a really awesome day for that. And also keep in mind too, the miracle question, it might have to be narrowed down a little bit too, in terms of if it's something like, for example, a death of someone, that maybe it's, instead of that person comes back to, that they're living again, maybe it's the miracle is that they're coping better, that they are feeling better and resolving it. And then we're looking at identifying solutions or past successes, exceptions, asking scaling questions, asking them potential challenges, what we call flagging the minefields, things that they might encounter, and then we can kind of find some solutions to maybe overcome that. And then giving direct compliments and like, wow, that's fantastic that you were able to do this, and be very direct about that, or indirect of, wow, asking the question, how were you able to do that? Giving them feedback that way, and then asking bridging statements and identifying tasks, kind of having that, the takeaway of the go-to, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then we collaboratively summarize and wrap up the conversation for it. But I always say to have that takeaway of what they can do for that. So I went through that very fast with that, but I just want to give you kind of a highlight. I included in my PowerPoint too some of my favorite books. This is not an all-inclusive list, but some that I have really enjoyed reading and using over the years. And then a couple of websites that I love too with that, with it, for Linda Metcalf and Russ Sabella's websites. And then with that, kind of pulling it all together, this is my contact information that I have here. If you would like to contact me, I have a lot of different resources that I'm more than happy to share with you all. And wrapping it up, I just want to thank all of you for joining me today in this very condensed presentation. So thank you.
Carol, that was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
And it's such a, out of all the speaking engagements we could have timed it with, was this such a positive ending to our talks. And I think if Mogadi was able to be here today, she would have looked with definitely excitement how you interweaved the cultural piece into your solution-focused therapy. It's a perfect bookends of our conversations today and last Thursday. Let's open it up for any comments. I see Gertina is hand raised, and then we'll go on to see other questions. Gertina?
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. Thank you, Carol. That was quite good. I used to also work more with solution-based and trained in that to the students in that, because I really find it much more culturally sensitive than what is popular in individual therapy with cognitive-based therapy and those kind of more individual problematizing or pathologizing approaches to try and work. So I really appreciated this today. I added to my work with the family a way that they could use certain arts. We've learned other arts about other arts today, and how you could use the collage life story elicitation in order to extract their perception instead of telling them what the problem is or trying to rephrase it, to let them get it from themselves through pictures. And sometimes one is quite amazed at what the problem is actually. One case that I worked with and that I wrote in the last book that Brian put together is that it was actually the child was having difficulty because the father worked too hard to give the child all the things that they want, instead of being there and making food with them. And it makes it much easier, particularly the cultural sensitivity. I think is, but where I'm now in South Africa, and after Molitsani's presentation yesterday, knowing how important the family is, and that the family can come in and collaborate in that process of looking what worked for us and what we need to work on some more. So I really appreciated your presentation today, and I look forward hearing some more from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gertina, as always. Who'd like to make some more comments today? Mirta? Mirta?
Yes, thank you very much, Carol, for this interesting job that's allow us to review our practices from another point of view, the engagement of people's resources and capacities. So thank you very much for this work.
Thank you.
I'm going to take the liberty of letting Judy Giampoli, who has joined us, that I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, that when she was putting a program together that was going to take away from some of the original theories that people use in the school-based family therapy, she snuck in a lot of material of solution-focused therapy to be done in the school-based family, which we were probably at about 25 schools at that time, maybe more. And it was so powerful to see how, not simplified, but how culturally sensitive it was for our San Francisco inner city schools to use solution-focused. Judy, can I implore that you would have a comment, because I remember you doing the orientation, putting that in like it was yesterday.
Well, thank you, Jackie. Carol, I loved your presentation. And I think it's so appropriate for schools. It just works so well when we have a limited amount of time to work with children, and focusing on their future is so natural to the life of a child. And yes, I have used solution focus, and in fact, I continue to do that in my work with adolescents. But when we were working with interns and trainees, having a very straightforward approach, like your PowerPoint, where it was the first session, and helping them to understand what went into each of those elements was really helpful. And the feedback that I got from many of the interns and trainees is that it was a wonderful way to work with children that otherwise they would have felt like they didn't have the skill or the experience to work with kids. And this gave them a really nice guideline for beginning their work. And hopefully they continued to use solution focused. We would do sessions and check in with them on different things, especially like the miracle question and the scaling types of questions and how you can use them. And Gertina, I love the idea of combining that with your collage focused work. I think that would be just a wonderful creative addition to this piece. So Jackie, thank you for noticing that we did use solution focused way back when. Hopefully it's still continuing.
I will have to make sure that Tony has it on the list for orientation.
Yeah.
I see that Harmony is raising her hand, and we'd love to hear from you, Harmony.
I just wanted to say that, like, I really loved your presentation, and that, I don't know, just as a young person, like, hearing all of this, I have this dream that, like, someday we'll have schools that teach these things, not as, like, you go to a school counselor to hear this, but that it's taught as a class where students are, like, learn these type of skills as just a normal thing, so that everyone can use these on a regular basis, rather than when you finally reach that point where you reach out for therapy. So like this, I just love hearing everyone's different like approaches to helping people, because I'm adding them to my like little book of all the things I want to see in the world when I make that a school thing. So I just love this approach, because I've been thinking of like, we need these things for so long, but I like seeing it like as not just this thing I'm envisioning, but like actually a real thing that people are doing, and not something I think of in my head. So I just loved your presentation. It was really like empowering. That's all.
Well, thank you so much, Harmony. And, you know, when I think about it, you know, if I would have had more time to talk about, there's actually schools out there that are solution-based schools or solution building schools. Like, for example, the Garza School in Austin, Texas, or the School of Merit in South Africa, that are based on the principles of a solution-focused approach. And I think one of the exciting things that I love about it too, when I talk about empowerment, but it's breaking down the silos in the schools, and it's empowering it, and it's giving a voice also to the students. Because when I said that, students are probably more likely to, if we have to try to find solutions, if they're part of the solution, they're probably more likely to go along with it too. So yeah, I'm happy to hear that you're also excited about it being new to this approach, because I know my passion, sometimes I feel like, am I the only one that who I work with that? So I'm glad that a new person also can feel that excitement and joy, or that feeling of hope that I also feel too. So thank you for sharing.
Great.
It's interesting, if I can just make one more comment, is that this approach does not only work with the children, but it works with the teacher. In one place I work, to work from a solution-based approach with the teachers who are complaining about the students in their class, because the teachers are often confronted with children that come to school. So this is not necessarily immigrant or refugee children, but regular children who are not very well disciplined at home. And then they come into the class and they cause a lot of trouble for the teacher, who tries to be a collaborative teaching approach. And then this approach, this solution for us to help the teachers to find ways to create a better classroom environment where everybody connects, instead of everybody challenging each other in the process. So it's really within the school-based family counseling approach, there is no better theoretical framework from which to work in a therapeutic sense.
And if I might just interject really quick, because I know we're running close to time, is that the WOW program, working on what works, and Sue Kimberg and Lee Schultz, who helped develop it, that's a perfect one. And I think, Richie, you were mentioning too that it works with parents, it works. We use it also even with faculty meetings. I've been able to slip in some of these, like my non-solution focused ones, about asking for best hopes, starting with positive comments at the beginning, because we know too, if we talk about neuroscience, about it increases the dopamine levels if you start talking about and reflecting on successes and positive thoughts with it. So that whole part of it too, that's a whole nother passion that I have about looking at the link with neuroscience findings and solution-focused approach.
That's fantastic. You know, the other thing is our general policy for school-based family therapy in general has always been strength-based, asset-based. And this fits right into that model so beautifully. And I think that's why we get excited about things like that, hoping they're going to work, but then all of a sudden we use it. Even if we start out as therapists in a small way, look at what we accomplish. You might grow to be a solution-focused therapy more often than not. Anyway, I see Judy raising your hand.
Yeah, Jackie, I just wanted to make one additional comment. When I was principal of a school and trying to deal with a few teachers who were experiencing burnout, solution-focused work was really using that language to support them was a really helpful strategy and skill that that I used with them. It didn't necessarily resolve all of their burnout, but it reminded them as to what their mission was and how they had gotten off course. And I just wanted to mention that as an additional way to work using solution-focused.
Are you listening, Kathy Landy? Her first talk on Monday was burnout of teachers. So this would be another conversation. Anyway, our time is going rather quickly, so I do want to get to a very important part, and that's number one, to have Tony have the final word of a thank you to our speaker, Carol. And Tony, are you available? And then we go to Norit for her proceedings conference. Is Tony there?
I'm here, Jackie.
You're the official thank youer.
Yes. Well, I think the gratitude has already been expressed in the comments by this group. Carol, you are like a blast from my past. I'm thinking about Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto and all of the work, groundbreaking work that was done there, that you have looped it around in terms of trauma work, which is a big focus in California, I think enriches the kinds of conversations that we can have. Certainly everybody's pointed out the hand in glove effect of solution-focused work in school-based family counseling. I had a personal fantasy that wouldn't it be an incredible research project to track X number of student clients with this work along separately with their parents. We meet parents who have the hard discovery that the children they hoped for were not the children that they got. And this is a very, very sad occurrence in a family. But I think taking this approach will help reignite the expression of love, which has never been lost, through the identification of the positives and the strengths, and being able to see your child as someone separate from you. You will also notice that I was jogged by both Jackie and Judy as the executive director for the Center for Child and Family Development to get cracking and bring you on board for trainings. I didn't miss the cue, ladies. Got it. Carol, the best. Thank you.
Right. And on that one